Hey guys, and welcome to the 7th episode of the Fantastic Film Factory, the show. Oh. Hey guys, and welcome to the 7th episode of the Fantastic Film Factory, the channel that is all about prop building and in-camera movie magic. Today I'm gonna show you step by step how I made this tiny silicone hand so that you can make one by yourself and make funny things with it. Hands on, let's start with a build. As you will notice, I didn't make this hand at my own workshop at home. I actually did an internship at Twilight Creations, which is an awesome SFX workshop based in Berlin, and I really learned a lot about the art of special effects there. I was able to do my own short project in their workshop, and so I decided to sculpt a small human hand because I've never sculpted anything really small with a lot of detail on it before, like skin structure. So the first thing I did was to look for some pictures of real-life human hands on the internet. I tried to find hands that had the actual pose I wanted to sculpt so that I had really detailed references for sculpting later on. I then printed them out and used them to build a tiny wire skeleton that matched the proportions of a real hand. When I was done with that, I mounted the wire skeleton onto a small stand made out of wood, which should make the sculpting a lot easier. I then began to wrap crumbled aluminium foil around the hand so that I had kind of a flash layer I could sculpt on later on. Also, the clay will have a much better grip on the foil than it would have on the wire. When I was done with that, I was ready to begin with sculpting. The guys from Twilight Creations recommended that I should use monster clay for the sculpting, which is an oil-based clay which doesn't dry out and is really good for sculpting really tiny details like pores, wrinkles and stuff like that. So I decided to give it a go. The first thing I did was to heat the clay in the microwave for a couple of seconds so that it gets soft and is easier to work with. I then began to apply the almost liquid clay to the wire skeleton by using a brush. When I had covered the entire skeleton, the whole thing simply looked like a big chunk of dirt, so I slowly began to remove clay from this chunk until I roughly got the form of my handbag, but now with a clay layer on it. I then continued to make the form more and more organic looking by removing or adding material. It's very important that you define and even out the form of your sculpt before moving on to the detail, because if your form is boring, you can add as much detail as you want, your sculpt will still look like shit. When I was more or less happy with the form, I finally began to work on the detail. I used a variety of different tools to make the skin structure as realistic looking as possible. Most of them were actually not mine, but belonged to a friend of mine who worked at Twilight Creations as well, and he was kind enough to borrow them to me. And he also gave me some incredibly useful sculpting tips. So Julian, if you're watching this, thank you very much for everything. In the following, I will go through the most important sculpting tools I used and which worked best for me. First of all, I used this pointy tool with a small ball on its end to make small indentations into the clay, which should break up the smooth surface of the sculpt and should also indicate pores. The cling film is placed between the tool and the sculpt. It helps to keep the rims of the sculpted structure as smooth and organic looking as possible. Cling film or any other thin plastic is very important when it comes to sculpting skin structure. Another important tool was this coarse sponge, which can be used to break down the sharp edges that sometimes appear if you do very fine wrinkles or skin lines. The sponge helps to smooth them down so that they blend better with the overall surface area of your sculpt. For the tiny lines that can be found on the surface of the skin, I used this homemade rake-like tool, which was made by using ultra-thin acupuncture needles. It is really useful for creating interesting, detailed skin structures. So here's the way I used it. I applied one layer of lines, again I used cling film to make the edges dulled, then I took the sponge to clear off most of the detail I just sculpted, and then I repeated the whole process over and over again. The more layers of lines you do, the more realistic and detailed will your skin structure look like later on. You can also always come back with a ballpoint tool to break up the surface again to make it more interesting. This tool was incredibly helpful for creating a smooth and even surface. It was made by using different kinds of guitar strings, which were bended into different shapes. And last but not least, this tiny loop tool was also used a lot to make tiny wrinkles and folds. And of course there are many other interesting tools which can be applied to create an interesting sculpt. When I finished sculpting, I was left with this sculpture, which is now ready for molding. To do that, I covered the sculpt in release spray, which should make the whole demolding process way easier later on. I then took such a plastic cup, removed the bottom and covered the sculpt with it. I then sealed everything with some more clay to prevent the silicone from leaking through any gaps. I also decided to sketch the rough layout of the hand onto the cup to make the cutting and opening process of the silicone mold easier later on. I then mixed some A and B component of an Ad-Zilter silicone together, mixed it thoroughly and degassed it in the vacuum chamber so that there are no tiny air bubbles in the silicone left, which could lead to a bad casting quality. Remember to work fast, since you only have a few minutes of working time. It also helps to cool down the two silicone components in the fridge before using them, because this slows down the reaction time of the silicone. Then I took the silicone out of the vacuum chamber and poured it onto the sculpt. Make sure to pour the silicone in a thin, even stream from the highest point possible onto your sculpt to take out even more air bubbles and to make sure that every detail of your sculpt is captured. When the sculpt is fully covered, I waited overnight for the silicone to cure. I then opened the form and cut it open. I tried to cut along the center line of the hand to make the seaming lines as invisible as possible. Make sure to always use a razor sharp blade so that you cut the silicone instead of tearing it apart. Otherwise you will have a lot of ugly looking seaming lines. It's also a good idea for this working step to ask a second person for some help. This will make the cutting and opening of the form a lot easier. When the sculpt was finally removed, I was left with a negative imprint of my sculpt, which could now be filled with silicone. But first I cleaned the form with some alcohol and an old toothbrush to remove any leftover clay pieces. I also covered the inside of the form with some ease release spray so that the cast could be taken out of the form later on without any issues. The form was now ready for casting. In the casting process itself, I actually made a few mistakes at first, so I ended up with a few unsuccessful casts, but after some trial and error, I came up with a pretty efficient way to do perfect casts almost every time. So here's how I did it. Before I poured silicone into the mold, I made sure that the mold was closed properly and then placed it into one of the same plastic cups I used when I made the silicone form. This way, the mold sat in a perfect fitting container, which held the mold together and kind of forced it to really close perfect without any gaps. I then put a second plastic cup where I removed the bottom on top and sealed the gap between the two cups with some extra clay. You'll see why I did this later on. I then took my setup to the vacuum chamber and began to mix some Platsil 25 silicone, which got cooled down in the fridge as well, together, mixed it and poured it, without degassing it, directly into the form. I then put the whole setup into the vacuum chamber and degassed it for about 30 seconds. This way, the vacuum pulled all the air bubbles out of the silicone, but also forced the silicone to flow into all the tiny fingers and into all the details. I got this idea from a friend of mine who has a workshop in Cologne, and I gotta say that this is very efficient. I got perfect casts almost every time. When the silicone cured, I carefully opened the form and took the almost finished hand out of it. And I promise there are very few things in life that are more satisfying than to take a silicone piece out of a form. I then used some scissors to remove the excess pieces. To take away the seaming lines, which are tiny silicone lines where some silicone leaked through the incisions in the form, I took a razor blade and carefully cut them away. Again, make sure that you use a very sharp blade. After I cleaned the piece with some alcohol, I was left with this almost finished silicone hand. The hand was now ready for some colors. First of all, I built this tiny stand out of a piece of plywood and a nail to make painting easier. After the painting specialist of Twilight Creations gave me some tips concerning materials and colors, I painted the hand with a mix out of a condensation curing silicone, wash petrol and some ordinary oil paints as pigment. I only used red, yellow and very little blue as colors. The several different painting coats should be very light so that you can barely see them. As usual, I kind of messed up at this stage. For example, I painted way too much red onto the fingertips. Keep in mind that when it comes to painting, less is almost always more. After I was done with painting, I was left with this finished, tiny fake hand. Although the result doesn't really look like that much, I had great fun to make this tiny hand, and I really learned a lot in the workshop of Twilight Creations, which is why I want to thank the whole team for giving me so many useful tips during the creation process. I'd really like to do some more projects using silicone, and I think that a project like this is a good way to get started. Well, and that's already it for today's episode. If you want to stay updated, you can subscribe, and maybe you have some ideas what project I should do next. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and remember to always stay creative.